Right, well, we'll go to Exodus chapter 20. And I'll not read all of the Ten Commandments, we've read them several times, but we've come to the fifth commandment tonight. And it's verse 12. And it's a lovely, lovely commandment. Honour your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. Honour your father and your mother. Yes, a lovely, lovely commandment. And as we've been studying these 10 words, as they're sometimes called, the Decalogue, meaning 10 words, we've been seeing, I think, very clearly how they spell out really our relationship with God, or how it should be with God, who is holy, of course. The first commandment, just to go back over briefly, was that we were to recognize God alone. It was to have first place in our hearts and in our lives. The second commandment, we're told that we should never make any visible representation of the invisible God, because that would could lead us into idolatry. And then the third commandment spelled out that we were responsible to take the name of God and live it out in the world, and treat the name of God with honour and respect and with reverence. And then last week, the fourth commandment, we learned that speaks about our responsibility to set one day in 7 aside as best we can to attend to God's honour and to also to our bodily needs and nourishment for our souls. And for Israel, we mentioned that that was the Saturday, the Sabbath day of rest, but for us it's Sunday, the day we celebrate the resurrection of Christ, and we voluntarily come together, assemble together with other people, other Christians, for worship and fellowship and time of praise and spiritual activity. So tonight we're coming to this fifth commandment, and this fifth commandment marks a major turning point in the listing of these 10 great, may call moral principles. It's the beginning of what's often called the second table of the law, the second tablet of the law. No one really knows if it was 5 and 5, but traditionally it's taken that the fifth commandment is the beginning of a whole new, the rest of the commandments, and a whole new focus. The first 4 that we've already looked at, you probably know this, and it was clear when we studied it. First 4 deal with our responsibility towards God. But the remaining 6 commandments, we've come to the fifth now, but the remaining 6 deal with our responsibility to each other, man to man, as it were. And that pattern reminds us that until we get right with God and get our priorities right, get right with God, there's no way we can be completely right with other people, and that includes parents. I think that's why some people have a hard time getting along with other people, and in many cases people are too easily offended, find it hard to forgive because they themselves are not right with God as the first priority. We have to be right with God, the vertical, before we can be right on the horizontal level. And so you could say that this fifth commandment is like a bridge between our responsibility towards God in the first 4 commandments, and then for the remaining 6, our responsibility towards our fellow man. I have some notes here, and so we can just give them out now anyway, and you can write in the back of them if you want, but yeah, I'll give them out now. Cecil, take one and just pass it on there. Probably not there, but you take one, pass one on. In fact, the first 4 commandments that we've already looked at provide a foundation, or a basis, if you like, for the next 6 commandments. Keith and I both know that you can't build a house unless you establish a good foundation, right? Hopefully you've got a good foundation, and hopefully ours is good. It's up anyway, standing the test of time. And the children of Israel, to whom these commandments were first given, they had to learn that establishing the foundation meant that they had to keep their relationship with God secure. That was the most important thing, the first thing. And just as then, the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th commandments build on that first one, I think that the 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 commandments build on the foundation of this 5th one that we're looking at, or we're going to look at now. And it's sometimes said that God's word is always relevant, and it is. It's always relevant. It always has a purpose for today, never mind back whenever. But it's more than that. God's word, and you know this very well, is absolutely necessary for our growth in grace and our knowledge of God. And it's if the first 4 commandments are focused on our duties of devotion to God, as they are, the second set of commandments, beginning with the 5th one, have this focus on our relations to our fellow men. And it's important to remember that in those duties, our relationship to each other, our relations with each other are really our evidence or an expression of our love for God, or at least should be. There's an inseparable connection in our duties to man and our love for God. Right relations with our fellow man flows out of our right relation to God. And if we're not right with God in some way, even as a Christian, if we're out of sync with God, or we're not saved, then there's going to be problems with relating to other people eventually, in one way or another. And I believe that, it's significant that in telling us how to, in these next 6 commandments, in telling us how to relate to our neighbour, as it were, our fellow man, God starts with our own family. Starts with the family. If we don't show honour and respect and respect authority in the home, we'll have a hard time respecting it anywhere else. And in the end, society will be the worse off for it when that's not happening. And I think we'll see that. So God begins this section of the 10 Commandments by dealing with the family, because home, family, is the foundational unit of society. There's an old saying you might have heard: as the home goes, so goes the church, and as the church goes, so goes the country. And there's a lot of truth in that when you think about it. There was a time when the home and the church, were important enough to set the tone for how the nation was. But it's not so anymore, sadly. And if that's generally true, that as the home goes, so goes the church, as the church goes, so goes the country, then it's no surprise that Satan will attack the family and family life in any way that he can. And I think we've been seeing that over the years. The breakdown of the family. And there's no doubt that this commandment is a timely word for the days that we're living in. And the message of this commandment speaks very clearly and very urgently, even, I believe, to the times that we're living in. Its immediate focus, although it's much wider, but its immediate focus is the family. Honouring your mother and your father. And so it presupposes, in saying that, honour your mother and your father, that it's normal that the union of one man with one woman for life in the covenant of marriage is how it should be. That's how God set it out to be. The union of one man with one woman for life in the covenant of marriage. Now we could get into a lot of stuff to do with that, but we're just going to leave that there. And in the context of that union, in marriage, should God bless a couple, husband and wife, a man and a woman with children, they're called to raise a family together in stability and in respect, and so on. That's the God-ordained plan for humanity from the beginning. But sadly, that's not the world that we live in today. I'm sure you'd agree with that. It's not the way it should have been, or it could be. Did a little bit of research and came across research from just 10 years ago, and I don't think it's changed any for the better in this, but it showed that 34% of children are living with an unmarried parent. That probably wouldn't surprise any of us. And at any one time, nearly 1/3 of all children aged between 18 and under don't live in the same home with their fathers. We have a whole population of children who've grown up without fathers, or without any awareness of fathers, or even knowledge of who their father is. And this research said that less than half of the children, this is in the Western world, less than half of the children spend their entire childhood with both their parents. Less than half. And that's the world that we live in. I don't think those statistics have got any better in the last 10 years, probably got worse. And also, you probably know this as well, more and more people are delaying getting married until later in life. I was married when I was 20. I don't know how old you guys were when you were married or whatever, but people are marrying later in life. In fact, a lot of people are giving marriage a miss altogether. They don't want to get married. While this fifth commandment pictures a stable home environment of a family, mother and father, and so on, family life in our day, compared to when it was first given with the children of Israel, family life in our day is more complicated. If we're honest about it, it's more complicated. And it's less reflective of the biblical pattern or the biblical norm than it has ever been. What God had set out to, the pattern for family life that God set out to establish, it's no longer the norm in the world. And you know that probably from your own family or your extended family or your neighbours or friends. It's just not the way it should be for many people and children. Part of that, I think, is because we live in a world, we live in a society that doesn't like authority. And also, I think we live in a culture that doesn't always respect old age, right? Now there's other cultures that do respect old age, seniority, eldership, and so on. I think the Chinese sort of culture, they have great regard for their elders and their parents and older parents and all of that. But we've seen, I think, in our lifetime, certainly in my lifetime, how parental authority has been gradually undermined for whatever reason, and even in many cases disregarded. Parents don't have authority. or don't exercise authority anymore. In fact, there's a thing called child-centered parenting. It's all about the child. And I remember our daughter, Melanie, when she had her first child, was into that. And it was all about child-centered parenting. And I remember Pat, my first wife, and I were home from Canada and we were visiting, and little Levi was only, I don't know, 3 or 4, maybe 5. But he got into the fridge and he took out a big carton of strawberries and he threw them all over the floor. And Pat, my wife, was ready to smack him and tell him not to do it again and have manners. But she held back, but Melanie got down on her knees beside him and said, "Now, Levi, Mummy doesn't like it when you do things like that. You shouldn't be doing things." And it was child-centered. I don't think Levi cared what she was telling him. But he would have cared if he got a smack behind the ear about it. But that's sort of society. Now, strangely enough, when she had her second child, that child-centered parenting went out the door. And it's a little bit different these days. But that's the way it is. So, having said all that, there's been I think, when you think about it, and when you read about it, there's been an unprecedented attack, in many ways, an assault on families, on family life, and on authority in general. So I think we need this commandment. We need it. But what does it speak to us? What does it say to us these days? Because these days there are broken homes, there are abusive homes. Unlike the days when God first spoke these words, we have extended families that live in entirely different parts of the country or even different parts of the world. And we have a culture that tends to cater to young people. Youthism it's called. And in some ways it kind of marginalises those of us who are a little bit older and grey in the head. So it's easy to imagine that this commandment comes from a bygone time, bygone era, it's out of touch with how life is today. Someone said this, I came across this quote, listen to this. "Youth today have too much luxury, they have bad manners, contempt for authority, no respect for older people, and talk nonsense when they should be at work. Young people don't stand up any longer when adults enter the room. They contradict their parents, they talk too much in company, and they tyrannize their elders." Now that might not surprise you as a comment, but that comment was recorded by Socrates, the philosopher, who lived 400 years before Christ. So 2,500 years ago. It reminds us that every generation has had, and young people have had issues, and parents have had issues, and young people with their parents with their young, with their children, right? Are you with me so far? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, really, this commandment, I believe, is a message really for our time, and we badly need to hear it again. And that's what we're doing tonight. And I just want to repeat, or maybe I haven't said this already, that this commandment is a bridge commandment, linking the two tablets of the law. And it's the perfect bridge between the first 4, calling us to honour God with all our hearts and mind and soul and so on, and bridging those commandments that come after, calling us to love our neighbours in so many different ways and respect our neighbours, starting with the family. It's like a connector, if you like, between the first 4 commandments and then the last 4 or 5. So first of all, notice how God begins this list of our horizontal responsibilities, our responsibilities to our neighbours, to in our human relations with one another. And the very first thing he says about that is honour your father and your mother. Secondly, if we're to read on ahead, in fact in the next 4 chapters in Exodus, there's a whole lot of more laws that God gives to the children of Israel after the 10 Commandments. We'll find, I haven't got the chapter and verse here, but God attaches the same judgment or penalty to disobedience of parents, the same as he attaches to blasphemy and idolatry and the worship of false gods. And in those times, the times of the Israelites, it was the death penalty. If you didn't honour your mother and your father, there was a consequence, and it was pretty severe. And I think that highlights the importance of this commandment to God, how strongly God viewed this as an important commandment and lesson that we're to learn. God is pointing, I think, in this commandment to the centrality of the family. It's the heart of God's design for humanity. And when the authority and the structure of family life breaks down, everyone suffers. Everyone suffers, one way or another. I see it in my own family, when things happen and still happening. And it's sad. But the fact that, just to make mention of this, that honour is extended to both father and mother. Honour your father and mother. We shouldn't lose sight of that, because in the world of the Old Testament, it was predominantly male. And yet in this commandment, the mother is afforded the same honour and respect as a father would be in that society. But our world, today's world, has become so strange in relation to this, and so contorted, if I can use that word, that a basic biological, natural statement such as you have a father and you have a mother is no longer the norm. It's true, I suppose, of course, over the years, some people were raised by a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle, or were adopted into a new family, or for some people they were made a ward of the state. But it can't be denied that every human being has a father and a mother. Agreed? We don't have a father and a father, and we don't have a mother and a mother. It's a father and a mother, and yet the culture, society, is moving in the direction of doing away with that. And you had didn't you have a vote there recently about some of these things? And thankfully the vote was that we're going to change, family and all of that sort of stuff. But that'll come up again. It'll come up again. So this commandment begins with one word: honor. Honor. The Hebrew word is kabod, K-A-B-O-D, kabod. And it's a word that's often translated glory as well, especially when it's used of God. And it's one of the great worship words of the Hebrew Bible. In Malachi chapter 1 and verse 16, God, through that prophet, uses the language of this 5th commandment and applies it to the way that we treat God himself. He says in Malachi 1 verse 6, as a son honours his father and the servant his master, if I then am a father, where is my honour? If I am a master, where is my fear? In other words, the honour that this commandment requires, requires children to give their parents is comparable to the honour that we all owe to God. It should be a mirror image of the same thing. And we're being reminded by that the way we live and the way we worship should fit together, intimately, which means that there's There is no way to truly honour God while dishonouring our family or dishonouring our parents. Those two things don't go together. Because what applies in the vertical relationship has to apply in the horizontal relationship between each other. To put it another way, the family, and especially the way that children are called to honour parents, it's designed by God to reflect the honour God himself should receive in all of our lives, in all of our living. It might even be said that the way children honour parents and the dynamics of the relationship within a family, how they get on, is a good barometer, gauge, of the place that God holds in the hearts of the members of that household. How family members treat each other is a good barometer of the place that God holds in their hearts. Remember I said at the beginning, it's the first priority, we're to honour God, and we can't really honour other people if we're not honouring God, and it will show. And where there's a deep rupture in the relationship between parents and children, when fathers and mothers are estranged from their children and vice versa, it ought not to surprise us that there's a spiritual problem somewhere in that family dynamic. Of course, we could say the opposite, and that's what this commandment actually, the positive side of this commandment, that where God is honoured, that dishonour or anger or festering resentments that can creep into family life, because we're all human and we live in a fallen world, so things will happen within a family. But if God has been honoured as a first priority, those things will increasingly begin to shrivel up and die and won't have as much of an impact as they otherwise would. A home where God is given honour and glory, generally speaking, will be a home that's characterised by honour between parents and children. So first of all, this is a bridge command, if you like, connecting together the honour that God deserves and the way we treat one another in the home and in society at large. But we could also say, not only is it a bridge command, but this fifth commandment is also a blanket command. It covers, or it blankets, I believe, a wide range of human relationships. Yes, it's honour your father and your mother, but it's more than that. It speaks very directly and obviously, to the relationship between parents and children, and that's referenced in various other scriptures. Colossians 3:20, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Ephesians 6 and verse 1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. So to put it bluntly, God wants children to do what they're told. And that little phrase, in the Lord, obey your parents in the Lord, is important. It means, on the one hand, that sometimes if we're expected to engage in sin, we have to disobey. But we also know that parents generally have our best interests at heart. And for the most part, when what they ask us to do is for the best, for our best, what God wants for us. So it's part of our duty in the Lord to be obedient. It's part of our responsibility to reverence and respect them, honour them and obey them, quickly and cheerfully and respectfully. And it's not easy. We know that if you've raised children, you know that's not easy to encourage them in that sort of thing. Because at the end of the day, as parents, parents have learned some things over the years that children don't yet know. So God has ordained that while children are still in their formative years, they're to be under the authority of their parents. Even Jesus himself, who was God in the flesh, honoured his mother, Mary, and Joseph by obeying them. You read in Luke chapter 2 and verse 51 says, and he went down with them, that's Joseph and Mary, and came to Nazareth and was subject unto them. It's a tragic thing when parents exercise little or no control over their children. And simply let them go their own way, do their own thing, and let them get away with being smart alecks. Children who receive no discipline are headed for disaster. And our prisons are full of people who are there because they never learned respect for authority, and it all started, in all probability, in childhood, when they were not made to be obedient by their parents. It's a sad fact of life. And the Apostle Paul might have been writing about our day when he wrote to the young pastor Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 3. He said, this know also, talking about the last days, and maybe we're in them because of what he's saying here. In the last days, perilous times shall come, for men shall be lovers of their own selves. That's true. Covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful and unholy. It's one of the marks of the last days, and he includes this disobedience to parents in the middle of some of the worst sins in the Bible. And he does the same thing. Paul does the same thing in Romans chapter 1 verse 30, listing backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents again. It's a characteristic of the last days. Now, of course, when a person becomes of age, whatever that is, I'm not sure when you become of age. It used to be, 18 or 21, or there's different legal ages that you can do certain things. It used to be 21, you get the key to the door sort of thing. I don't know if that still holds, but when you become of age, you're no longer obligated to obey your parents. You're an adult. But if they have had the right kind of relationship, children and parents, they'll probably always value their parents' opinion and views and counsel and so on. But they're no longer, you're no longer under a divine mandate to obey them. The obedience you owe to your parents doesn't, having said that, it doesn't cease when you're no longer under their roof. Or it does cease. But the honour you owe them never ceases. It never ceases, because although you cease to be a child when you became an adult, you'll always be a child of your parents, right? And so we should always honour them. I suppose for some adults that can be hard for different reasons. Mark Twain once said, when I was a boy of 14, my father was so ignorant I could hardly stand to have the man around. But when I got to be 21, I was astonished at how much he had learned in 7 years. See, children sometimes think they know better than their parents. And our grandson, that little boy who was so disobedient and so on when he was 4, now just turned 13 there last weekend, and he's a teenager, and there's times he thinks he knows more than his mother and father know, or his grandfather knows. But God calls children to be humble, to accept instruction, to honour parents as a way of saying, I love Jesus, I love God, I want to please him, and as part of my desire to honour and please God, I seek to honour and obey my parents. That's how it should be. And the role of parents is made very clear in Scripture. Parents are to love and protect their children, provide for their needs, exercise fair and appropriate discipline, encourage them, teach them, and so on. They're to teach by example as well as instruction, because children resent it when parents tell them to live one way, but then the parents themselves live a different way. And so God has a word for parents as well. Right after telling children to obey, in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 20 that I mentioned, children, obey your parents in everything that pleases the Lord. Paul says in verse 4, and fathers, do not provoke your children lest they become discouraged. And in the same way in Ephesians chapter 6, right after quoting the 5th commandment, Paul says, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. That's our calling as parents. And so parents should strive to be honourable themselves in the ways that they treat their children, so that in turn children might learn to honour them in return. So, having said all that, let me say that this commandment, God's command to honour our parents, has no exception clause attached to it. Many of us were blessed with godly, loving, caring parents. But even if your mother and father failed you, we're still to honour them. You know, in a court of law, the judge is usually addressed as Your Honour, right? Your Honour. It's an expression that has nothing to do with the personality of the character or the person that's being addressed sitting up on the bench. He's addressed as Your Honour because of the position that he holds. And in the same way, we're to honour our parents because of the unique position they hold in our lives. They give life to us to begin with, regardless how poorly they may have done their job as a parent. We're still to honour the fact that they are our parents. And God intends that parents and children should strive to love each other. But regardless of the relationship that exists, we're to treat our parents, children are to treat parents with respect and honour. Even if the parents have fallen short, you're still to respect them, honour them. Because the fact of the matter is you have parents and they have you. And all concerned, parents and children, should work as hard as they can, as much as they can, to make that relationship strong and a loving one. I mean, great men of history, biblical history even, have treated their parents with respect. Even Joseph, who had become the Prime Minister of Egypt, as you know, when he was reunited with his aged father, Jacob, it says in Genesis 48 and 12, he bowed himself with his face to the earth before Jacob, his father. According to the custom of his day, he was showing great esteem and honour and respect to his father, despite all that had happened to him during his life. And then in 1 Kings chapter 2, we read about King Solomon's response to his mother, Bathsheba. When she came to speak to him about a matter that concerned her, it says, and the king, Solomon, rose up to meet her and bowed himself unto her and sat down on his throne and caused a seat to be set for the king's mother, and she sat on his right hand. So the attitude that we have towards our parents, or anyone has towards their parents, says a lot about their character. Well,
is that the queen that came to prove Solomon, was it? No.
I'm not sure of the context there.
Remember, she heard of all his wealth.
Right.
Well, she hadn't heard half of it, she said, when she found him.
Right.
Is that not the queen of
Sheba?
God's wisdom.
Sheba, that was the.
She came to hear his wisdom.
That was the one that his mother David had the affair with, Bathsheba. Remember? And Solomon was a child. But I have to look it up. 2 Kings chapter 2, or 1 Kings chapter 2, and verse 9 to get the proper context of it all. But the point is that Solomon showed respect and honour to his mother. Well, the 5th commandment clearly deals with parents and children, but as a blanket commandment, it covers many more relationships than simply that between parents and children. It speaks about the way we're to relate to authority wherever we find it. Certainly parental authority. But how do we speak about our leaders, especially when we disagree with them, coming up now to an election? What is our vocabulary about those people? What does it say about our heart and our posture and our attitude when we're being called to show honour to those set over us by God and His providence? Well, there's an election coming up in the north as well, the general election, and the level of political interaction in current debates in our country, north or south, the mocking, the sneering, and so on, certainly reminds us that we've fallen far from the honour which the fifth commandment calls us to give to those placed in positions of authority. We're called to show honour even when we differ and we disagree. So in this commandment, yes, very obviously parents and children are here. Honour your father and your mother. Civil authorities are here. Even leaders in the church are covered here as well. In Galatians chapter 4, verse 19, Paul addresses believers as my little children. And in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, he likens his ministry to the tender care of a mother and the encouragement of a father. And even those older than us in society are to be shown honour and reverence, the same honour and reverence as our fathers and mothers. 1 Timothy chapter 5, do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father. Younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters, in all purity. We're to show honour, respect to our elders. And so long as obedience to men doesn't require us to break God's law, the fifth commandment calls us to give all reverence and honour and dignity and obedience in the Lord to everyone in a position of authority, whether it's politicians, government officials, church leaders, mothers, fathers, and even those who are older than we are, because it's a blanket command. It covers all of that. And just think about how remarkable and distinct a church would be that embraced and lived out the fifth commandment before the eyes of a watching world. And Jesus put it very well, by this shall all men know that you are my disciples, by your love one for another, by the way you honour each other, by the respect and the love you display in your dealings with one another. An honour like that stands out, I believe, particularly in the world in which we live today. It's a rare characteristic to find, but it should be there. And yet, how often do you hear about arguments in churches and divisions in churches and rows in churches and splits in churches? It's sad. It really is sad. So to really sum it all up, the fifth commandment is a bridge commandment, bridging the first four commandments with the rest. It's a blanket command that covers more than just honouring mothers and fathers. And it's also, if you want to just use the B word, blanket, bridge, it's a beacon command. A beacon is something that guides ships into a safe harbour. And the fifth commandment directs our steps into the way of blessing. Notice when Israel was at, where Israel was at this moment when they were given this commandment in their history at the foot of Mount Sinai on their pilgrimage, out of Egyptian bondage, through the wilderness towards the land that God had promised, into the land of Canaan, a land that they didn't yet possess. And God is saying here, if you live according to my law, I'll give you not just the land for your own possession, but a long life with which to enjoy the land that I'm going to give you. That's what the commandment says. Honour your father and your mother so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God has given you. Now, we could be tempted looking at that last part of the verse to spiritualize this promise. But this side of the cross and this side of the empty tomb, some of that promise has to be adjusted slightly. There's no longer for the church a promised land to inherit. There's no parcel of land on the earth promised to us. The promise now is that the meek shall inherit the earth. And so we're back to humility, humbling ourselves, honouring, respecting. And if we go back to that verse in Ephesians chapter 6 where Paul is emphasising the obligation of children to honour their parents, we see him continuing to apply this promise as well. It's in the latter part of the verse. There's no longer now a promise of a specific homeland for God's people other than the heavenly home. But he goes on to say, honour your father and your mother. This is the first command with a promise that it might go well with you and you may live long in the land. That's what Paul says in Ephesians 6, first couple of verses. There is a promise of a general blessing in this life for those who live in conformity with God's law and in obedience to his standards. God promises a happy life ordinarily will be found in an obedient life. It may not be easy, but this blessedness, promise, if you like, follows honourable human relationships, especially those mentioned here in the home, but also in the church and in society at large. Blessing and obedience are connected, and although sometimes, as we all know, suffering and hardship interrupts life, intrudes on life, God's promise stands nonetheless that those that honour me, I will honour in one way or another. And we'll just leave it there for now. There's other verses that I was going to talk about. I'll just mention them to you. I haven't put them in your notes, but if you want to write them down, you can. Proverbs 23 and 22, 23 verse 22 says, listen to your father who begot you, and do not despise your mother when she is old. Wise words. Proverbs chapter 1 verses 8 and 9 says, hear, my son, your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Indeed, they are a graceful wreath on your head and ornaments about your neck. Lovely way of describing it. Proverbs 10 verse 1, Solomon says, a wise son makes a father glad, but a foolish son is a grief to his mother. Exodus 21, just after these 10 commandments, it says, Exodus 21 verse 17, he who curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. Wow. I wonder how many times that happened. That would make you wise up and obey your parents, wouldn't it? Deuteronomy 27 verse 16 says, cursed is he who dishonours his father or mother. And all the people should say amen. And then Proverbs 28 and 24 says, he who robs his father or his mother and says it's not a transgression is the companion of a man who destroys. So the Bible is full of good advice on this subject and on the wider issue of how we should respect and honour one another in all sorts of ways. So we'll leave it there for tonight.